Oh my goodness, look at this one. Look at the scrap quilt. This is the old quilt we're going to talk about today in Lessons from an Old Quilt. It's actually not a quilt, it's a quilt top, or flimsy, you can see. It hasn't been finished, which we'll get into in a little bit. Before we get started talking about this, however, my name is Chris O'Neill from Sew the Distance. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode of Lessons from an Old Quilt, where I look at old quilts, talk about what we can learn as makers, modern makers, from quilts like this, and bring that practice, or whatever we can learn, into our own quilting endeavors. All right, so let's talk first about the history, or what I know about this quilt. So I got it in an auction. I paid $20 for it. It is from what I think is the 1950s. When I started really looking at the fabrics, that was the latest fabric I could find in here. There are some really old fabrics in here, however. There are some I think are from early 1900s, maybe even late 1800s. This quilt is mostly hand-pieced. There is some machine piecing. Again, we'll talk about it when we look at the back of this. Speaking of which, let's get started taking a closer look at this gorgeous quilt. Let's take a closer look at the scrap quilt, and we're going to look at the block first. So I'm going to show you where that is because it's super hard to see. And yes, it's very puckery, which we will also talk about. Okay, here is the block. Oh, it's so pretty. Let me show you my mock-up of it. So you can see it here. There are 29 pieces in this, and we see squares and triangles and diamond shapes, all kinds of stuff in this block. And you can see that here, with the square in the middle that's on point being the focal point of the block. Everything else is in here though, and it's so great. I love it. So pretty. In this block, there are 29 fabrics. 29 of them, and there are 72 of these blocks. That brings the grand total for this entire quilt to 2,088 pieces of fabric in this. Can you believe it? All right, so let's look at the fabrics because they're so wonderful. And when I first started looking at this, I thought there's a lot of navy blue, there's a lot of red, there's a lot of pink, but then when I got a closer look at it, I noticed there's turquoise, and there's pink, and there's purples, and there's everything else, every color of the rainbow you can think of. So everything was thrown at this quilt, and it's so great and so chaotic and wonderful. We even see some plaids over here that were tossed in. All of these fabrics appear to be cottons as far as I can tell. In fact, I would say I'm 99% sure that they are all cottons, but we do see some older fabrics like this one here, and there's a few of the navies that I believe are a bit older. There is also a repeat of fabrics that happens, and I was going to take the time to figure out how many different fabrics were represented in this quilt, but no, that's not happening. Either way, it's so beautiful. But what's really interesting about this is to look at the back, and that's one of the benefits of having a quilt top, because you can really see how it's made. So let's flip it over. All right, so you can see all of the wonderful stitching. This is all hand stitched with the exception of the rows. So where the rows are put together, it is done by machine, which is interesting to me. Why is that done by machine, but the rows are pieced together within each other by hand? I don't know. All of it's done in white thread, and you can see that here. It's so pretty, but I'm sure you've noticed, and I mentioned it before, it is super puckered. Now, a lot of these puckers could possibly be pressed out, but there are a few that just won't be. There's a few solutions to that. You could add a stabilizer, you could use some steam, but some of them are so prominent that it's just going to cause a crease when you go to quilt it. You can see even as I lay this flat, it creates more creases everywhere else. This quilt may have to be taken apart and resewn because of that. I'm not sure exactly what to do, but I definitely want to make sure I save this quilt in some way. Another option is that I could tie it and use a really thick batting that will ease some of these puckers in, but I still think there's going to be some that are going to have to be creased when it's quilted, and that makes me sad. A lot to think about with this one. As you can see, this was not English paper pieced, or at least there's no evidence to me of it being English paper pieced. It was hand pieced together. Also, it's important to note that somebody young might have been making this and learning about bias and about the fabrics and how they lay. Either way, it's so pretty. I love it. Even the back. The back is so pretty because we get to see all those navies and wonderful stuff coming out of it. Let's flip it over again, and let's just closer look at some of these fabrics, and I'll show you some of my favorites. One thing I really love are these turquoise florals. I mean, look at this one. Look at how pretty. but we even have some browns in here, so it didn't stay strictly brights. And then the polka dots. How can we not talk about the polka dots? There are pink polka dot-ish stuff. There's pink polka dots here. We have navy blue polka dots over here. We have some 1940s print dots here. Oh my goodness. They're just sprinkled all over. So much fun. And we have stripes and plaids and just, I love it. I love this quilt so much. Isn't this amazing? Oh. So let's talk about what lessons we can learn as modern makers from this beauty. The quilt police sometimes get a little crazy and go a little overboard because really this quilt breaks a lot of rules. One of which is it doesn't give a place for your eye to rest. And I am so here for it. I mean, come on. How can you not be happy by looking at this quilt? Does it break the rule, you know, that you should have some resting spot for your eye? Sure. Do I care? Nope. Not one bit. So when we're making our quilts, keep that in mind. Sometimes you have to break the rules and just have some fun. That being said, my second lesson that I want to point out to you is about those puckers. Yes, you can press out a lot of puckers. You can steam them out. You can ease them in when you're quilting. You can do all kinds of things to hide puckers when they happen. But these are so intense and so off. There's so much extra fabric there. You would have to quilt in a pucker. And that's something I'm not willing to do. I'm gonna have to go in and fix these or do something, which we'll talk about in a minute. That said, as makers, we need to make sure we identify these mistakes when they happen, or maybe not when they happen, but when we notice them, because now that this is in a complete quilt top, it's a much harder process to ease those pieces in, and it's gonna take a lot of time. And I can't help but think that that's the reason that this quilt was not finished, or at least partially the reason. There are other fixes, but for me, I just think it deserves to have it fixed the right way, which means taking some of the seams apart, sewing them in so you can ease some of that bulk in. Anyway, I'm digressing. My lesson for you on this one is fix those problems before they become an entire quilt top. And finally, the last lesson I want to point out, and by the way, I have other lessons on my blog for this. I always do a blog for my lessons from an old quilt, and I'll link that below. Check it out because I do go into more detail with things, and I also give obviously more lessons too. I also want to hear what you have to think, what you can learn from this quilt. All right, the last lesson is to save these quilt tops. They're everywhere. I see them all the time. I pass up so many quilt tops at auctions just because I have quite a few as it is. Try to find some old quilt tops. These are just a great resource that's out there that probably are ending up in the landfill, so save them. And finish your own quilt tops that you have sitting in your cabinet, because most of us have a lot of those too. All right, so what am I gonna do with this quilt? Well, I still am thinking that through because I really love it as a quilt. I really have to see how hard it is gonna be to identify all those puckers and to make sure I can ease them in, because I might just do that, but I might also take it apart and make some other projects with it. I'm not sure. Tell me what you think I should do. What I did notice is the last quilt that I did lessons from an old quilt for, and I actually reconstructed that quilt and made this zipper pouch. If you saw that video, if not, I'll link it. I made this zipper pouch out of those blocks, but look, it kind of goes. And I have quite a few of these blocks left. So if I repair this, or even take out parts that are puckered, I could border it maybe with a solid, put a solid skinny border and then add these around the outside. Wouldn't that be a great quilt? It would kind of go with the whole feel of this. So I'm kind of thinking about doing that. I don't know. You let me know what you think I should do. Either way, I can't wait to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you take some time to sew, and I'll see you real soon. Bye.